Good morning and welcome to Practicing Medicine in the Jewish Community, Part 2. I'm grateful to Bayit Adult Education for, again, partnering for this series for the year, as well as to those who wish to remain anonymous who helped to make sure we would be able to have the series and file for credit and so on. I'm going to send out a follow-up email, God willing, in the next couple of days, which will include a link to an online evaluation form. It's just a couple of questions. It's not terribly elaborate, but we do need people to fill it out, even if you are not a medical professional. Nonetheless, it helps if you fill that out because the accreditors want to get people's reactions to the class. A couple of the questions are related to medical practice. You would just skip those, or you could answer them, I suppose. But please make sure that you do sign in. And make sure that you have a copy of the source sheets. So this is actually the second part of 2, because we had a class last April on practicing medicine in the Jewish community, and at that time we dealt with 3 questions. The first question was a confidentiality question. What happens when people within the community approach you with questions about patients of yours? The shidduch scenario was the one that we gave at the time. The second question was the one that people seem to ask about most. The right of a physician to close the practice or to say certain hours I'm not seeing people. People can't call me at midnight and expect that I'm going to answer the phone and take care of them. All sorts of variations on that question. And then the third one was the issue of whether you could allow somebody to jump the line. A friend calls you up and says, I just need to get my son in for a quick strep test this morning. I'm really busy. Could I get in? So those are the questions we dealt with last time. I think I will send out the link to the first part of the series when I send out the follow-up from today for anyone who wasn't there and didn't have a chance to hear it online. But for today, we have 4 additional questions. The first one, well, you can see them there on the sheets. The first one is an issue of billings for care given on Shabbos. The second one is a question of my rabbi versus the patient's rabbi. What happens if the patient requests a service, which my rabbi, as the doctor, I'm not a doctor, but my rabbi says that it's not allowed. His rabbi says it's fine. So, am I allowed to refer him for the particular procedure involved? The third question is an issue of seeing a patient where there's an issue of providing intimate care potentially, or just generally inappropriate intimacy. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the case. And then the fourth and last, is the issue of reporting OHIP fraud. And all 4 of these questions have applications that go far beyond medical practice. But these are questions that were submitted to me, questions in one form or another, questions that can come up during medical practice. One thing that is important to me, I think I stressed this in the first half of this topic. If I didn't, I should have. Is that it's hard to strike a balance between the sources and practical reality. Meaning that there are certain issues that come up which you look at and say, well, that makes this fairly black and white and not necessarily in the direction that we want to go. The example that I always like to give is Rabbi Dr. Aaron Levine, Alav Hashalom, who wrote extensively on business ethics. So he would always invoke religious issues and issues of halacha, which you'd look at and say, well, technically I can understand why that might apply, but that's going to make life really difficult. So, for example, he wrote about the issue of telemarketing and whether a telemarketer is guilty of lo sachmod. The lo sachmod is a prohibition against desiring other people's money, other people's property, and the job of a telemarketer is to push you to spend on something you did not intend to spend on. Is the telemarketer guilty of lo sachmod? And then on the other hand, there is a prohibition in the Torah of onaz devarim, of verbal abuse. If you are rude to a telemarketer on the phone, are you guilty of onaz devarim? So by the time you've finished with that discussion, nobody is pure anymore. Either you're guilty of lo sachmod or you're guilty of onaz devarim. So I'm trying to balance what I feel the issues are here with the practical reality, recognizing that this can be challenging. So our first topic is the issue of charging for medical care provided on Shabbos. To read the vignette aloud from the sheet, Sherry, a family physician, takes care of a laceration for her neighbor's daughter on Shabbos afternoon. May she bill OHIP or her neighbor for the labor and or materials after Shabbos? That's that's our opening question, and we're going to be building here on what you see in source number 1. The links there are for classes that we've had before that discuss the issue of charging for healthcare and billing for Shabbos work. So we've discussed aspects of this in classes before. And now we're going to deal with it in terms of the question which unfortunately comes up when people need medical care on Shabbos. Is the doctor, in fact, allowed to charge for that service? What would you think?
Yes.
Yes. Why yes?
The doctor's been studied for 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, prepared. Something they don't prepare.
The doctor has worked hard for years to develop the knowledge base. That's not a Shabbos aspect, though. That's just a general charging for healthcare question. Shabbos adds some nuances. Yeah.
Is this a treatment which has no follow-up, or is the person going to be seen, check it on it after Shabbos to see whether it's healing well or any other follow-up?
Right. So Harold raises the question of, is this a situation in which there's going to be follow-up after Shabbos? Why do you ask?
Well, because then the totality of the therapy was not purely limited to Shabbos. Part of it was after Shabbos. You could charge for the totality of it, potentially, if part of it was not involving Shabbos.
Right. So Harold looks at the Shabbos issue and suggests havla'ah. Havla'ah meaning you absorb the work that's being done on Shabbos and the payment for that work with payment for the job in general, and maybe that mitigates the problem of being paid for work done on Shabbos. Yeah.
I think we also learned that it depends on the span of time of healing. That if you're doing,
I'm going to repeat it. Don't worry.
That if you're doing something that you start the process of healing, but it's not completely healed after Shabbos, then that would allow it to understand that the process you started or finished after Shabbos.
Right. So there's a potential suggestion, which I'm going to sort of shift a little bit, that the healing may continue after Shabbos is over. It may be that what you provided on Shabbos actually has an impact beyond that. And indeed, there is such a view that suggests that the healing, even though the act that you did is on Shabbos, but the impact of it is beyond, maybe that will make this more acceptable. Yes?
Does it make a difference because you're not giving the patient specifically a bill, but billing the third part of the insurance plan after the fact?
Right. So the question that's asked is maybe the fact that you're billing the third party, you're billing OHIP, and then you're certainly not handing a bill on Shabbos. Does that potentially impact this as well? It seems not. I mean, it certainly would be worse if you handed a bill on Shabbos. But you.
The bill after Shabbos is different. You're beginning to the patient specifically, or the patient's not involved at all in reimbursement.
Right, so that would seem not. I mean, it does help on another front, which is, what I didn't address in here is, in general, the practice of billing your neighbor for something. And the problems that may create in your relationship. In that sense, billing OHIP is better. But from a Shabbos perspective, ultimately I am still billing for work done on Shabbos. So let's go through this. The first issue that we want to address is the question of whether you're allowed to charge for medical care in general. And I'm going to go through that relatively quickly because we've dealt with that before. But I want to make sure we're on the same page on that front. And then we'll talk about the fact that this is Shabbos. So first of all, as I noted here in source number 2 from the Shulchan Aruch, you're allowed to charge for supplies. This is not questioned. Whether the supplies are used on Shabbos, whether the supplies are used during the week is irrelevant. You're certainly allowed to charge for supplies. The Shulchan Aruch there deals with a limit on what you might charge for your supplies. Mishi yesh lo samanim in source number 2. If someone has medicine, v'chavero cholev etzarech lehem, and somebody else needs it, asur lo lahalos bidmem yosim en hara'ui. You're not allowed to charge too much. Now, what is too much? We actually had a separate session on that, on what is too much. It was in a business ethics class. I don't know if I did it as part of a CME one. What constitutes too much when it comes to charging for medicine is a fascinating question in its own right. But the point here is everyone recognizes that you can charge for the materials. The only question is, what about the actual medical care? Seeing the patient, having the conversation, making the diagnosis, offering the prescription. Those are the issues that we're asking about. So the Shulchan Aruch also writes in source number 3, Harofei asurli tol schar ha-chochma v'halimud. I'm going to come back to the second half of number 3, but right now, just the first half of it, the Shulchan Aruch says you are not allowed to take payment for your knowledge and for limud, which means your teaching. It doesn't mean your learning. It isn't talking about your medical bills, your medical school bills, your tuition. It's talking about your imparting of knowledge to the patient. And the basis for this is a Gemara in Nedarim that says regarding teaching Torah that one is not allowed to be paid for teaching Torah. And on that basis, it is expanded to teach that one also should not be able to charge for medical knowledge and teaching others, because this is a mitzvah. Having said that, it is explicit in various sources that you're allowed to charge for medical care. The Torah says in the laws of Nezikin, the laws of damages, that if one person wounds another, then the person who wounded the other is responsible to pay for 5 different kinds of damage. Nezek, tsar, ripoy, sheves, and boshes. The one I want to focus on is the one called ripoy. Ripoy means healing. Right? So the person who did the harm is responsible to pay for the medical bills of the victim. Well, how can he pay for the medical bills if there are no medical bills? Obviously, there is a concept of paying for healing, and that's not my insight alone. Reb Chaim David Halevi, the Tosa Harash points this out. You could argue, well, maybe it's talking about where there's a non-Jewish doctor who does the healing. Maybe it's talking about paying for the medication. But the bottom line is that in many sources we find it accepted that, of course, the doctor is going to charge. I'll give you one example in source number 4. In the case that I just mentioned, the case where person A harmed person B and then has to pay for the medical bill. So the Gemara asks the question, what if person A who did the harm says, well, you know what, my brother is a doctor and he'll take care of you for free. Is he able to do that and therefore exempt himself from having to pay medical bills? So as the Gemara classically says, Asya de magin b'magan, magan shava. A doctor who heals for nothing is worth nothing. That's the Gemara's phrase. So my point is not to weigh in on that question of whether that's really true. You can all have that conversation. My point is only to say the Gemara takes it as a given that of course you pay the doctor. So the question is, how did you get from the Gemara Nedarim and the Shulchan Aruch, which say the doctor's not allowed to charge, to the point where everyone is recognizing that of course doctors charge? How did you get from point A to point B? So we have 3 justifications for charging in general. The first justification is the weakest of the 3. And that is, you're not supposed to charge. However, when the patient pays you, you're allowed to accept the payment. That's the first justification is, well, after all, they want to pay me. And this comes up in the commentary of the Taz to the Shulchan Aruch in source number 5, Rabbi David Halevi writing in 17th century Poland, when he says that it's the patient who obligates himself to pay, and the reason why it's acceptable, as the Taz explains, is because everybody wants there to be doctors. Individuals need physicians, and they are willing to pay for it. And the doctor could always have said, as far as saying, well, I'm doing a mitzvah, and therefore I shouldn't take payment. Somebody else could have done the mitzvah. It didn't have to be me. So the fact that I accepted upon myself the duty of healing others, and the patient wants to pay, so I am happy to accept it. That's one approach. A second approach, similar to this but not quite the same, is that in general, not just the individual patient, but society needs physicians. Society is willing to pay for them. And as the Gemara in Bava Basra notes, which I brought you in number 6, society is allowed to accept upon itself whatever system it wants for wages and for the governance of professions. So society is able to say there's a cap on what people can charge, but society is also able to say that there is a charge, that there is a fee, and the doctor is allowed to accept it. Now, there are limits to that, in the sense that you're not allowed to charge excessively. And this is found not just in halacha, this is also found by the law. In source number 7, I brought you Ontario's regulation on professional misconduct. The following are acts of professional misconduct for the purposes of Clause 51(1)(c) of the Health Professions Procedural Code. One of those is charging a fee that is excessive in relation to the services performed. And then, of course, you have to figure out what exactly does that mean. And the law has its own way of calculating this. But the same thing is true within halacha, that you're not allowed to charge too much. So what you have as one basis for accepting is society says, pay, so I'm allowed to accept payments. But that's the weakest of the 3 justifications. What are the other justifications? Some of you were here when we discussed charging for health care. What are the other justifications for charging a patient?
If you don't pay him, the doctor's not going to want to do it.
Right. So a second justification, really this covers sort of number 2 and number 3, is do you really want to have doctors? Meaning that because it's in the best interests of society, not only will we say, if the patient offers it, the doctor is allowed to accept it, but the doctor is allowed to say, I had to invest in being able to practice. And that's a key element on 2 fronts. One is called schar batala, and the other is called schar tircha. Schar batala means payment for the fact that I didn't do something else. And whether that means during the specific act of healing I could have been day trading stocks, or whether it means, in general, I went into the profession of doctor, nurse, any of these supporting practices that are involved in communicating medical care, I went into that instead of becoming an architect, instead of becoming a rabbi, instead of doing whatever it was that I could have done. So I should be paid for not doing that which I could have done in some other circumstance. I shouldn't lose by going into medicine. And those are your second and third justifications. Schar tircha, payment for the work involved in... that's schar batala. That's payment for not doing something else. And then the last one is schar tircha, which is payment for the work involved, meaning there was strain in doing what I had to do in order to provide medical care, whether that means going to the clinic, or whether that means going to the hospital, or whether that means, any of the ways in which I may have to do work in order to provide medical care. These are justifications, and that's the second half of what we saw back in source number... Which one was it? Number 3. The Shulchan Aruch said, Schar hatarach v'habatala mutter. You're allowed to take payment for strain and time lost from other remunerative pursuits. And the Shulchan Aruch is not making that up. In source number 8, you see it in the Ramban. Ramban writes in his Taras Ha'adam L'inyan Schar Refuah, as far as payment for healing, nearly the mutter litol mehen schar batala v'tircha. I think you're allowed to take payment for the time lost, that's the strain involved. Aval schar halimud asur. You wouldn't be allowed to take payment for the actual information that you gave to the patient. That far he won't go. Yes.
So that means that if it takes me an hour to educate somebody, then I can take the time,
correct,
nothing whatsoever about the preparation or about the actual content and what it cost me to get that content.
Except insofar as you'll say, I spent time learning it and gaining that content. I read journals, I did whatever I did. That was time I could have used for some other money-earning pursuit. And so therefore I'm going to charge whatever it is that I need to see from my medical practice that justifies my not pursuing other things. That's the way that this would work. Yes?
Why doesn't that argument hold up for any other profession? Well, I'm an architect and I'm charging you because I could have been a doctor.
Because an architect is allowed to charge straight. Meaning the architect is not, in the strict sense of the term, performing a mitzvah. I mean, they're supporting their family. That's a mitzvah. But if they don't charge, then they won't be. The idea here is that because medical care itself is a mitzvah, I'm not justified in simply saying, well, here's what the market will bear for medical care, and I'm going to charge on that basis. You need to look at it instead in terms of time that I could have spent on something else, or the strain that I invested. Now, strain is a funny thing. Meaning the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Chil Michal Epstein, was willing to say that writing a prescription involves strain. Now, he's writing in Poland in the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th. I will accept that it involved more strain than it does to type in a couple of keys on the keyboard today, or even, scribbling a note that no one can read on on the pad. I accept that it involved more work than that. But how much strain was really involved 100 years ago in writing a prescription? Nonetheless, he said that counts. You can charge for the strain involved in writing a prescription. There was a hand over here. Was it Brian? No. Okay. But that's the last justification. I actually got very confused when I was preparing this, and I thank Albert for helping me out. And you take a look at the regulation in number 9, also part of the Professional Misconduct Act. One of the items listed is charging a fee for an undertaking to be available to provide services to a patient. Meaning, it sounds like what it's saying is that if you charge for making yourself available to patients, that is misconduct. And I said, well, that's schar batala. That's exactly the definition of schar batala. I'm charging to make myself available. But then did a little more research, and with Albert's help, with the help of a couple of others, I understood that's not what this is talking about. What this is talking about is... Alana, you were going to say?
No, I was just going to say that you can be paid to be on call.
Right.
Actually being called in.
Correct. So that's not what this is. What this is... Sorry? Yes. No, you're allowed to be paid to be on call, which is essentially what this sounds like. What this is actually talking about is where you insist on a block fee, where you say to the patient, I'm not willing to have you pay for specific services rendered. Instead, in order to be part of my practice, you're going to have to pay me X number of $1,000s a year. And on that basis, I will provide services for you that are uninsured by OHIP. So, bless you. You're allowed to actually charge a block fee as long as you also offer the per service option as well. That's the way the rule works. This isn't about schar batala at all. It sounded like it at first, but it's not. Yeah.
In the present day and age, with nurse practitioners prescribing and pharmacists starting to prescribe, how does that translate to them?
In terms of?
They do it on Shabbat.
Right. So are they allowed to...
Can the nurse practitioner then go back and bill for what she did?
Right, so we didn't get to Shabbos yet. Right now all we've done is discuss general payments. Now we're going to have to move to Shabbos. But before we discuss Shabbos, just one other note. Not all of these justifications are going to work for off-hours medical care. Meaning, schar batala, the idea that I didn't go into something else, and now I'm in this profession instead, doesn't work if you're talking about care you provided that wasn't during office hours. Because you didn't stop engaging in other things so that you could do this at 11:30 at night or on Shabbos afternoon. So schar batala doesn't work as an option there. Schar tircha does. Payment for your effort does, and the argument can be made. There's more effort involved if it's 11:30 at night, or if it's on Shabbos when I should have been resting. You have a greater option to argue for schar tircha, payment for the strain involved. But let's talk Shabbos now. What about the fact that this is Shabbos? So the basic problem is this. Wages for Shabbos work, generally speaking, are prohibited. So I brought you the Gemara in source number 10 that talks about hiring somebody to guard the para aduma, the red heifer. And the rule is that person may not be paid for Shabbos work. That's not the most common example of Shabbos work. It happens to be a very clear one-line Gemara, and that's why I brought it. But the same will apply for other types of labor as well. So that if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, in source number 11, the Code of Jewish Law says, "Hasocheres hapoel lishmor zra'im." You hire a worker to guard your field. O davar acher, or something else, whatever it is. Eino nosei lo schar Shabbos. You can't pay him for the work done on Shabbos, right? This commonly comes up with babysitters. The question of, I hire a babysitter for Friday night so I can go somewhere. Am I allowed to pay the babysitter for work on Shabbos? Shabbos youth groups, chazanim, a rabbi who's just going to come in and speak on Shabbos. All of these come under this question of, are you allowed to pay for work done on Shabbos? The general prohibition is a rabbinic prohibition. It's under the prohibition of mekach umemkar, commerce on Shabbos. The concern is that once you get into paying people for something, inevitably you need a receipt. Right? Who pays somebody and then doesn't get a receipt to prove that they paid? That's a bad idea. Fine, we don't get receipts with babysitters, generally speaking, but maybe we should. The point is that in general, once you get into paying people for services rendered, you get into written receipts, and that's a violation of biblical law. So in order to avoid that, you have a rabbinic prohibition against commerce on Shabbos, which includes paying people for services rendered. So we do have, though, various rationales to permit payment for work done on Shabbos. One is the argument of havla'ah, and that goes back to what Harold was saying before, where the work is going to continue during the week. Meaning, if the work is not just Shabbos work, but something is done during the week. So, for example, you hire somebody to lead youth groups Shabbos morning, but they have to do work on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in order to prepare the materials that they're going to bring in and use on Shabbos. So then they're allowed to be paid a block sum for that which they did. You hire a babysitter to babysit a few nights, and one of them happens to be Friday night, so you can pay them a lump sum that will 100% take into consideration the hours that they worked. In other words, we're not playing a game in which we say, well, we didn't really babysit for me for 6 hours, you babysat for me for 4 hours, but I'm paying you an extra amount for whatever because I like you. That's not what we're saying. Because they worked those 3 nights, they can be paid a 3-night fee, even though one of those nights happened to be Friday night. So that's one rationale here would be if you are in fact making yourself available for medical care that will run not just on Shabbos, but you're going to follow up with them after Shabbos. So they came to your house and they had a laceration, and you did what you wanted to do for the laceration, but then you're going to take a look at it again after Shabbos, so you could bill OHIP for the work that you did, if it's legitimate. If it's not legitimate, you run into the fraud case we're going to talk about later.
But you're twisted, because you could say, I'm just doing 2 visits.
Well, you are doing 2 visits, if you really are. Yes. Julie, and then Andrew.
I understand you can say, I treat you on Shabbos, I need you to follow up with me on Monday, and you're billing OHIP for the Monday appointment, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can bill OHIP for the Saturday appointment, no?
No, so that's the idea. The idea here is you're able to bill for the sum of, and we're going to get to better justifications anyway, but the idea is you can bill for the overall medical treatment, understanding that OHIP is going to want you to list the individual ones with their codes. Yes, Andrew.
When you're talking about the babysitter,
yeah.
Are you talking about a Jewish babysitter or any babysitter?
I'm talking about any babysitter. Yeah.
Even a non-Jewish babysitter
right.
who only works for you on Shabbos.
So the non-Jewish babysitter, in other words, does Schar Shabbos apply if you're dealing with a non-Jew who works for you on Shabbos, as opposed to the Jew? So I think it does, but I'm not 100% sure. I want to look it up and answer you properly. I'm not 100% sure offhand. It's a good question. I'll note it down.
Because then again, we're talking specifically here about Jewish doctors, but let's say a non-Jewish doctor treats you on Shabbos.
Right. I was looking at it from the Jewish doctor perspective. I wasn't thinking about it from the opposite direction. It's a good question. The other thing that I actually want to come back to after I get a chance to look it up was Julie's question. because now I'm not 100% sure, where you're actually billing separately, where there are separate codes and separate filings and so on, is it really considered to be havla at all? I'm not so sure that it is. So I want to look into that as well and follow up, which is a good time for me to remind people, since not everyone was here at the beginning, make sure you sign in, please. There are 3 sign-in sheets. Can someone just tell me where the sheets are? There's one there, and there's another one here. Okay, 2 towards the front and 1 in the back. But make sure, please, that you do sign in. The other rationales are stronger than the Havla rationale. One of the rationales is that payment for a Shabbos mitzvah in general is fine. Even though we said guarding the para aduma is not fine, nonetheless, in general, you're not allowed to pay people for work done on Shabbos, but mitzvahs done on Shabbos actually are okay. And this is seen in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, regarding hiring a chazan. The Shulchan Aruch says, in source number 12, Asur liskor chazanim litpalel b'Shabbat. You are not allowed to hire a chazan and pay him to daven to lead services on Shabbos. V'yesh misha matir, and then some permit, and his some permit is based on the idea that if it's a mitzvah done on Shabbos, then you are in fact allowed to pay, which is really, when you think about it, counterintuitive, because we don't like people being paid for mitzvahs. We don't like people being paid on Shabbos, and now we're going to pay for mitzvahs done on Shabbos. It seems that like a double negative has resulted in a positive, but in fact the Chasam Sofer discusses this. Mr. Zalman Meltzer discusses this and says that if there is a need for a Shabbos mitzvah to be performed, you are allowed to pay for it. The second justification is more or less the we need a doctor's justification. Meaning that if you didn't pay for people to provide medical care on Shabbos, you wouldn't have medical care on Shabbos. The Ma'ari Bruna, an early authority, discussed this regarding the case of a midwife, and it's brought afterwards by the Mishnah Brura, the Mincha Shabbos, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. If you take a look at source number 13, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, I quoted him just one line out of his article on this, where he says, "V'adai diyesh la'atir litol scharo." He says certainly one may accept payment. We'll permit that. Because otherwise they may not show up in the future. That's a terrible thing to say about doctors, that maybe they won't take care of people. But the truth is, what you have are gray area cases. That's where it becomes difficult. Meaning, if it's a black and white thing, this patient needs to be seen and needs a doctor, and it's important that they be seen now. I'd like to think that, generally speaking, people who have committed their lives to healing professions are going to take care of the patient. But then you end up with the vague ones. Do they really need? Does it have to be me? Can it be now? Can it be in a couple hours? And that's where knowing I'm going to go through a whole lot of hassle and struggle in order to get there, and I'm not even going to be paid afterwards, may to some extent shade a person's judgment on the issue. Do they really need me to come right now? Maybe not. And that's what he's concerned for. And then the third one, and this goes back to the point that was made before, is Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who says something very novel in source number 14. V'yesh lahosif od. You could also add, you're also healing them for the week. And he's paid for the weekday benefit. In other words, if somebody is ill today, and I treat them today, I didn't just take care of them on Shabbos, I made sure they'd be healthy on Wednesday. And therefore, what I'm being paid for is not the actual work I did on Shabbos, but the result, which is that on Wednesday they're healthy. So therefore, it's a novel idea. But Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank has shoulders. He's able to say something like that. And on that basis, you could in fact be paid. So I also brought you, no, I didn't bring it on the sheet. It sits Eliezer as a justification. Maybe you could accept it as a gift, but I don't think you even need to go there. The bottom line out of all of this is that one who provides medical care for a neighbor on Shabbos will be allowed to bill OHIP for the care that they provided. if only under the justification of we need doctors to provide medical care on Shabbos, or you heal them so that they will be well during the week. It would be better if they were also seeing them after Shabbos, so you would have the Havla option of absorbing this in with what you did after Shabbos. I think that would be a better possibility. What we didn't discuss here, but if you go back to the links that I provided in the beginning of this section, you'll hear it in the discussion, the longer discussion that I provided, number one in the first bullet point, is the question of what about if you provided care that required that you violate Shabbos in order to do so? What if you were, you were called to the hospital and you needed to get there violating a biblical, rabbinical, whatever it was that happened? There are nuances when it comes to care that requires that you break Shabbos to do it. Separate from the question of whether you're allowed to or not allowed to, which is its own discussion. Are you allowed to charge for that? And the arguments are made both ways in terms of the propriety of charging when you had to actually break Shabbos in order to do it. But that's beyond what we're going to get to in this session. Go to those links and you can hear the recordings on that. The second issue, questions on the first one before I push it on to the next one. Okay. The second issue. Doctor's rabbi versus patient's rabbi. So I have to admit, this was one that was not actually submitted to me, but I really wanted to talk about it because it's a fascinating halachic question. This is not one that I was asked about. Yes?
The one I told you this morning.
The one you told me this morning is one example. This is true. I don't know if you want me to now say it. No, better not.
Sure.
Yeah? Okay. Where there are conflicts in terms of end-of-life care, DNR, palliative care, and so on, and you could have a case where a relative of the patient, maybe the one who actually is holding the power of attorney, insists on certain things, which the doctor's rabbi has already told him are actually halachically inappropriate. So that's one case. Another case is the case that I gave you on the sheet. I'm not going to read it now because it's a long case, but you can see it. The case where the patient wants a referral for a radical prostatectomy. There's a concern that it may actually involve severing something which you're not allowed to sever. There's the vas deferens, but the point is that that we discussed this in a class many years ago. It's got to be about 7 or 8 years ago. We talked about the issue of rendering somebody a saris, rendering somebody incapable of having children, and there may be certain procedures which some rabbis will permit and some rabbis will prohibit. So the question is, are you allowed as the doctor to prescribe something, to refer for something where your rabbi says no, and the patient's rabbi says no, this is fine. Another one would be birth control, right? Where some rabbis have some policies and other rabbis have other policies. And the patient says, I went to my rabbi, I asked the question, and my rabbi said it's fine. So stop bothering me with what your rabbi said. I don't care what your rabbi said. That's not your job. So what happens in that situation? So as we've discussed elsewhere, when I gave you links in source number 15 to 2 recent classes that dealt with this issue, one in the context of abortion, the other one in the context of medical assistance in dying, the general rule of professional ethics will require that if you can't provide the service personally, you are, your conscience is offended by it, whatever the reason is, you're supposed to refer to somebody else. And in the event that you can't refer, providing what's called effective referral, that you can't refer to somebody to do it well, then you may end up being on the hook to do it. I'm not going to talk about here the question of what happens if you're on the hook. That we have discussed in those other classes. But the question is, are you able to provide the referral? So the short answer is yes. Even though your rabbi says no, you are able to provide the referral. The question is why? And there are 3 justifications. The first justification is the one that we talked about when we dealt with abortion and medical assistance in dying. It's based on ideas in the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, with more recent endorsement from Rav Asher Weiss. If you take a look at source number 16, this is from Rabbi Waldenberg's tshuva, Rabbi Waldenberg's response regarding abortion, and somebody who is not the actual doctor who would carry it out, but would be providing supporting services. I forget if it was the radiologist or the anesthesiologist who he was addressing in the responsum. But he pointed out a few things. Number one, in source number 16, he pointed out that your role in this is not really an issue of lifnei iver. This isn't an issue of putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, because this is a service that will be available somewhere else if you didn't provide it. Rather, the issue that we're dealing here with is called misayeya. You are assisting somebody else in what you believe to be wrongdoing. That's the concern, and that's a rabbinic prohibition. And so he says you don't need to lose your job for the sake of avoiding violating a rabbinic prohibition. That's point number one. And you could lose your job for failing to provide effective referral. That's number one. Number two, he says that, and it's still within source number 16. I'm just summing up what you see there. He also writes that the prohibition against misayeya, against helping somebody in his sin, may not apply if, again, he has access to the service elsewhere. It doesn't have to be you. If he could get it from somebody else, then the fact that he gets it from you doesn't mean you have violated Jewish law. Is everyone clear on this? I'm rushing a little bit on this point, and maybe I shouldn't. But are we clear on what Rabbi Waldenberg is putting forth here? He's saying that the prohibition is not the biblical prohibition against causing someone to stumble. Rather, it's the rabbinic prohibition against assisting. And since he could be assisted elsewhere, you may not be violating it. And number two, really, which I stated first, you would not need to lose your job to avoid this rabbinic prohibition against aiding and assisting. So those are part of his justification. An additional justification that he points out is that the case he's dealing with is a supporting service which is provided before the abortion, in the case that he's talking about. And therefore he's okay with it. And I brought for you in source number 17 a source supporting that, a Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, which talks about the issue of assisting somebody who is going to process grapes inappropriately, but you assist before the act. You bring the barrels to the wine press. You bring the barrels afterwards from the wine press to wherever they have to go. So you're not helping during the transgression itself, so you're okay. All of these will potentially apply to the case where you're going to provide referral. You're not helping in the act itself. You're helping beforehand. You're providing something that somebody else could provide as well. Another note that he provides to justify it is source number 18, which is a source that discusses the issue of renting out a storefront to somebody who's going to keep the store open on Shabbos. Am I allowed to rent out a storefront to somebody who's going to run his business on Shabbos? So Rav Shwadron, the Marsham, in source number 18, was asked that question, and his answer was that you are indeed allowed to do so because you are not helping him do the act. You are simply providing him with a storefront. It's a background step, and then he's able to do it. There are various justifications for this, and those are one set of justifications. Rav Asher Weiss quotes this even regarding the issue of effective referral for medical assistance in dying. He's not happy about doing so. I should stress that. He's clearly upset about having to permit it, but he says if we don't, you won't have Torah observant Jewish physicians because of the way this law is being applied and the requirement for effective referral being on everybody, at least at that state. At the time when he wrote this, actually when he didn't write this was an audio lecture, the link is in number 19, he felt like it was a necessity. Sorry?
There's only 30 seconds of that audio.
You're right, no, that's correct. It's at 1 minute, 16 seconds of the audio. But that was his justification. It was less about, I think this is okay, and more about, I think we're stuck. And that was what led him to permit it. However, in cases less dire than the medical assistance in dying case, I think there are easier ways to justify you providing the referral where his rabbi has already permitted it, on two fronts. Number one, you can make the argument that once his rabbi has permitted it, your rabbi is not allowed to prohibit it. This is the flip side of what is commonly called rabbi shopping or psak shopping. Meaning, we have a basic rule. which people usually think of in terms of, again, the opposite case. I had a question. I wanted to know whether a certain food is kosher. I had a chicken, we shechted the chicken back home, and we weren't sure whether it was in fact kosher or treif. So I brought it to the rabbi, back in the day when a rabbi would have known how to answer this question. Back in the day when I would have had my own freshly shechted chicken. But I brought the chicken to the rabbi, and the rabbi says treif. I happen to know that there's a rabbi down the block who's more lenient. Am I allowed to go to him and ask him to rule on this chicken? The answer is no. That's an easy one. That's relatively straightforward. Take a look at source number 20, which is your source in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Tana Rabbanan, the Brisa says, "Hanish'al l'chacham b'timei, lo yish'al l'chacham v'yitaher." If someone asks a chacham, someone asks the sage a shayla about a particular item, and he says tamei, you can't ask somebody else who's going to say tahor. L'chacham v'aser, you asked him about a certain thing, a certain action, and he says it's prohibited. Lo yish'al l'chacham v'yitaher, you can't ask somebody else to permit it.
What if it's the other order?
So that's exactly the question that we're addressing here. The Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, said this works the other way also. Meaning, you asked the rabbi about the chicken, and the rabbi said kosher. No other rabbi is allowed to say treif. Take a look at source number 21, Rabbeinu Asher's commentary on that Gemara. He quotes the Yerushalmi, which said, Chacham shetiher ein chaver rashai l'tamei. It's the opposite of the version that we had in source number 20. That if a Chacham said tahor, if he said pure, then the other one is not allowed to say impure. He tir, if he permitted it, ein chaver rashai la'asor. The other one is not allowed to prohibit it. V'tzarech la'okumei shekvar chala haras harishon tem shenechlak chaveru alav. He says the case has to be where the first ruling was issued. In other words, this doesn't prohibit debate. If you brought it to the base medrash and there were multiple rabbis there, and the first one to weigh in said, I think it's fine, that doesn't prevent the other ones from disagreeing. If the first one said it's no good, that doesn't prevent the others from disagreeing. They're having a discussion. But once the psak is issued, once the ruling is issued, that's it. It's binding, whether to prohibit or to permit. Now, not everybody agrees with the Rosh. Right? This is sort of a meta case. Can you disagree with the Rosh who permitted this and say that it's prohibited? Take a look at the Ritva in source number 22, in which he disagrees and says it's not so. He says, Lo tema lo yisha lachatchila davko mishum kvod arisha. And his first point is a separate point, but what I wanted to get to is what he does at the end of it. He says, Dekevan dekama chacham v'roy la'ora, since the first one was a sage, and he was suitable to rule on this issue, kishahara aleh lesor o letuma shavye chaticha de isura. He says the operating principle here is that when you declare something to be prohibited, it actually becomes prohibited. The declaration itself creates a reality. You said it's usher, now it's usher. The person who went and asked the question has demonstrated they're going to follow what he says. He says usher, the thing is now usher. As opposed to the opinion of the Rosh, who says, no, it isn't about making it prohibited. There is such a thing as ruling this is permitted, and now nobody is able to disagree. Julie, you had your hand up before.
So, this I can see if the patient says, oh, my rabbi says it's fine, the doctor says, oh, I don't know, and then talks to his rabbi. Well, you can't do that because you already had this ruling. But the case described in the text is the patient says, oh, my rabbi says it's okay, and the doctor says, oh, but my rabbi already asked basically a related question, and he says it's fine. So you've got two rabbis who just... So which rabbi came first? Right,
so what you're asking is actually very important on a broader front here, and it was a point that I was about to emphasize, because I think you're hitting an important point here. What the Rosh and the Ritva are talking about in this discussion is where the ruling was made for a particular case. Not where an overall policy was stated that wasn't about this particular case. That's why I gave the chicken example, where you actually went to the rabbi with it. The specific shayla had to be asked in order for it to be given that status. So in other words, let's say I know that Rabbi so-and-so permits birth control under certain circumstances. He says that, and I don't want to give a set of circumstances because it will be totally misappropriated. But he says, under certain circumstances, I permit birth control, and he lets it be known. That does not now mean that everybody who heard that is bound by that heter and cannot go to somebody who is going to tell them that it is prohibited. It's only where a ruling is issued on a particular case, and in that case the order is established by whoever ruled first. That's the idea. But just I realize I didn't do number 23, which is really important, because this is the ruling of the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, on this issue of going to two different rabbis where the first one permitted it. He says, Chacham Sha'asar. I'm going to go with the English just in the interest of time, but you have the Hebrew original as well. Once a sage prohibits a particular item, his colleague may not permit it based on his own judgment. However, if he has a tradition which indicates an error, there is a possibility of appeal. If the second sage has a tradition that says, actually there's a mistake here, or he believes the error is regarding fundamental text, he may permit. In other words, it's not true that the door is closed once the first one has ruled. If there's a mistake, then the second one can indeed argue. And even if the alleged error is in judgment, well, you'll say it's a judgment call. He may debate with the authority until he recants. You're allowed to go back to the original authority and say, well, what about this? And see if you can get him to change his mind. Therefore, one should not prohibit a person from asking a second opinion, so long as he informs the second authority that the first one has already prohibited. For a variety of reasons that are beyond the scope of this discussion, you have to let him know. And even if the first one permitted it, and his ruling has already taken effect, this is a key line for our discussion, the second may not prohibit based on his own judgment. So the Ramah sides with the view of the Rush from number 21, and says indeed that once it is permitted, you don't have the right to prohibit it. So what that means is that even if the doctor's rabbi says this is not allowed, that has no bearing on the patient's situation. That won't allow the doctor to carry it out, because the doctor's rabbi was the one who said prohibited. But it means that you can't prohibit it for the patient. But then I get to the third, and what is to me the most interesting justification here. And I give credit where credit is due. Source number 24. A friend of mine, Rabbi Gil's student, wrote an article on this a few years ago. It's available at that link. And I loved what he did with this. When I am concerned about not causing somebody else to sin, right? Lifnei Iver, or its subset, or its rabbinic offshoot of not aiding somebody else in sinning. There are two different ways to look at that prohibition. One way to look at Lifnei Iver, not to cause people to stumble, is to say that Lifnei Iver is a function of the prohibition of a particular act or on a particular item. Meaning, if I had a piece of food here that's treif, I am not allowed to eat it because it's treif, and I'm also not allowed to cause somebody else to eat it because it's treif. Right? That's one way to look at Lifnei Iver. In other words, it's a function of the prohibition against use of that item. That item is prohibited, and therefore I'm not allowed to cause somebody to use it inappropriately. That's one way to look at it. I think that's the way we normally look at Lifnei Iver. The other way to look at Lifnei Iver, though, is that it is a general prohibition against causing people to sin. Whatever sin looks like. Now, the difference there sounds subtle until you get to the application here. If I take the first view of Lifnei Iver, the view that says, if this thing is treif, I can't feed it to anybody else, then if my rabbi says that it's treif, I believe it's treif, and therefore I am not allowed to feed it to anybody else. If my rabbi says this act is prohibited, then I shouldn't refer somebody to be able to have it done. However, if I take the second view, that Lifnei Iver is simply a broad prohibition, don't cause people to sin, it's not a sin for him. His rabbi said, mutter. His rabbi said that it's fine. Assuming that he's not mistaken on some basic idea, there is no prohibition for him. The fact that I believe it's prohibited does not create a Lifnei Iver situation. You follow what I'm saying? I thought that was a really sharp distinction, and it makes sense. If we say that Lifnei Iver is, if I think this is prohibited, then I also can't cause others to have it, then there's nothing to discuss. But if it's really not a function of the item, it's a function of the person, and for this person it's 100% permitted, then even if I believe it's not allowed, I am still able to lead him to use the item. Yes.
So if that person came and didn't say, I went to my rabbi, said, permitted, I just want this procedure done,
then I still have a problem. Correct. Then I still have a problem. Or I say to him, go ask your rabbi. But that would be correct. And this comes up in a variety of circumstances as practical halacha. The Mabit dealt with it in source number 25. He dealt with the following question, which Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach also dealt with. I think I brought you Rosh Shlomo Zalman as well, in number 27. I'm going to deal with it in Rosh Shlomo Zalman's context. The question was this: we have a practice in Israel called the Heter Mechira. Right? The Heter Mechira is a leniency regarding Shemitah. Right? I am not allowed to grow produce in the sabbatical year, in the Shemitah year, in a number of different ways. I can't work the land and so on. However, there is a leniency accepted by many rabbis that says that in the event that the Jew sells his land to someone who isn't Jewish before Shemitah, the non-Jew is allowed to perform certain acts, not all acts, but certain acts in farming the land, and that produce is then going to be permitted. I wouldn't be allowed to buy produce from the Jew if the Jew had farmed the land, but I can buy it from the non-Jew. So Shlomo Zalman Auerbach dealt with the question of, what if I personally do not follow the Heter Mechira? My rabbi is not supportive of the Heter Mechira. However, I know other people who are. And I have produce that was grown under the Heter Mechira. Am I allowed to sell it to somebody else? And Rosh Shlomo Zalman took this approach to say, look, there are legitimate rabbis who believe in the Heter Mechira. Therefore, it's not lifnei iver for you to sell it to this other party. That was an example of the permission. There are various other cases in which it comes up, but to apply this back to our original case, before I take questions, just to apply this back to our original case, if the patient asked his shaila and was told it's fine, and the doctor knows from his rabbi that his rabbi would never permit it, nonetheless, there is justification for doing the referral. The first justification is the sort of last-ditch one provided by the Tzitz Eliezer and endorsed by Rav Asher Weiss in dire situations, saying that, well, look, we want to be able to have doctors, and you could say he could have gotten it somewhere else, and after all, it's only a derabanan then, and that kind of an approach. The second approach is to say your rabbi can't prohibit it for him anyway. And then third, building on that, the idea that it's not lifnei iver, you're not causing him to stumble, because for him it's permitted. It's not about you, it's about him. Julie? Yeah.
Are you required to ask a patient which rabbi, did you talk to a rabbi, or I'm not going to treat you until you talk to a rabbi?
So I think under professional ethics you can get into a lot of trouble for that.
Whatever, just say that's your business.
Right, so I think under professional ethics, if you did that, you would get into a lot of trouble for having that conversation. So I'm not really sure. That's why I worded it the way I did in the case, that he volunteered that he has spoken to.
Okay,
Sorry?
No. Hang on. You can ask whatever you want in that situation. Would you be, from a halachic standpoint, required to ask your patient which rabbi did you speak to, or did you speak with a rabbi?
So this is very interesting. I want to hear what Albert has to say, but I'm going to come back to it. Yeah.
It's perfectly legitimate to ask somebody, if this has a religious realm, do you want to consult with your clergy?
Mm-hmm. You can say that and not get in trouble.
I do it regularly.
Okay.
From the way
I still want to come back to you. Yeah.
From the way Shlomo Zalman puts it, it sounds like he would be matir anyways, because he sounds like he's talking to a person. He sounds like he's answering this question for store owners who didn't ask the shaila. And he says even though they don't know anything about shvius, they would for sure be makel if they asked the shaila.
Correct.
They would for sure have asked the makel rabbi.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. It's a lot more fun than what I'm excerpting. There's a lot more going on.
So it could be that you don't have to ask your patient, because they would for sure, if they've already come.
So you can make the argument that they would have asked and they would have been told mutter. And I hear that. Andrea.
What if you're dealing with somebody who's Jewish, not religious, not likely to ask the question? You know that your rabbi would not permit the procedure. This person is not going to go and ask anybody. They want the procedure done.
Right. So that goes back to what Avi had just noted, which is that the question was, what if they're not observant and they're not going to ask the question of any rabbi you mention? So it's true that if you look at the case that Rav Shlomo Zalman dealt with in number 27, it's worth it. I'll read it out loud. He says, therefore it appears, as I have said, that when the produce is permitted, one may purchase it from them without fear that the money will be handled without the sanctity of Shemitah. That's why I didn't want to get into it. It's a little bit more complex than I've been giving it credit for. What happens is, the question that's asked here is, if somebody buys Shemitah produce, then the money that is transferred in exchange for the Shemitah produce gains the sanctity of Shemitah. And I am not allowed to put that money in the hands of somebody who's going to use it inappropriately. So that's a level of concern here. He says you need not be concerned. Even though the result of the spread of the Heter Mechira is that many merchants, to our great distress, do not know anything about the laws of Shemitah, still, if it is clear that were they to know, they would certainly listen to those who permit, there's no concern for creating a stumbling block. So you have a justification even where they're not going to go ask somebody. There is that possible argument. Zev, that was what you were going to say?
I think that's the question, just the last words. In other words, I don't have to ask this person. Excuse me. I'm aware that there is a contrary or another opinion, lenient opinion, which would facilitate what the person's asking. Therefore, I don't even have to think twice about it. Regardless of whether or not I know that person is asked, there is such an opinion, therefore.
Right. I mean, what this does.
He can rely on it.
Right.
Then that gets into, we'll talk about it afterwards.
Okay. All right, but I mean, what it does do is it eliminates leniency number 2. My rabbi can't prohibit for him because he doesn't have somebody who has actually permitted it. That's what would then be gone. Ellen.
I was just surprised about the specific case because presumably this radical prostatectomy was for someone with prostate cancer, and it would be a life-saving procedure. Why would it be
Right. So the answer is that the way it was actually given to me when I ran my vignettes past Albert was more nuanced than what I put in here. He gave me the rating that the patient had that made this a potentially important procedure without it being a life and death case. If you want the specifics, I'm sure he can give it to you, or I can send you the email from it. But substitute any case you like. It doesn't have to be this case per se. I always get in trouble when I have vignettes because I'm dealing with a room of people who know the medicine way better than I do. But I wanted to come back to the question that Julie asked before, because there's another way to look at this, which I'm still digesting, and that's why I didn't include it here. I found a book online when I was researching a different class. It's not really a book, it's kind of small, and the production values are extremely lacking. It looks like it was somebody's doctorate and then combined with other articles. But it's called, the title is Hebrew, but it's Judaism and Psychotherapy. So it's Yahadut v'Psychotherapia or something like that. And they ask the question in one of the articles: if you are working with a couple and you're providing counseling and their marriage is prohibited halachically, are you allowed to try to help them stay together? You're laughing, but this comes up. It comes up. It's not such a surprising case. And there are all sorts of other questions that are asked within that when you are providing counseling for somebody, and you know they're engaged in behavior which is halachically prohibited, and are you allowed to provide them with counseling, or do you have an obligation of tochacha? Do you have an obligation of religious instruction? So I didn't get into this on the sources, and again, I'm still digesting what I was reading there because I find it difficult, but it had some pretty good names attached to it. The view that a professional is not the same as another person within the community. In other words, if I am a random person within the community and someone comes to me and says, I am getting married. Let's give a clear-cut case. Someone says to me, I'm getting married to someone who's not Jewish. Where halacha is fairly black and white on this one. Am I under an obligation to tell them this is wrong? Am I allowed to say I'm happy for you? It's clear that you have questions of tochacha. What is the legitimate response for you to give? However, the authorities who asked this question about the psychologist said, no one is looking to you as a professional for your personal support for their actions. And therefore, you are not considered to be providing tacit approval by helping them with their marriage. I thought that was a really interesting distinction to make, and like I said, I'm still digesting it. It's going to come into Shiurim in the future, because I just need to, I only found this over Sukkot, and I'm still processing it. But I think it's a really interesting question. I'm going to go further because we have 2 questions left. I want to get to at least one of them, if not both. So, the third of our 4 is the issue of the member of the community who is, I gave the case of a male doctor, female patient. It could just as easily work the opposite way. We dealt with this question to some extent a while back, and I gave you a link in number 28 in a shir on yichud and intimate care, the issue of seeing patients and seeing them in private and all the variations thereon, the issue of yichud, not being alone with somebody of the opposite gender. So yichud is a very serious issue in and of itself, even if it never leads to sexual impropriety, meaning this is something that somehow gets by people. There is a prohibition in terms of a man being alone with a woman who is not his wife, a woman being alone with a man who is not her husband, even if it never goes beyond them having been alone together. Just the yichud itself is prohibited. There is some debate. Is this biblical? Is this rabbinic? Is it biblical if it's with a married woman versus rabbinic if it's with a single woman? Not to the point right now. I brought you the Shulchan Aruch in source number 29, which simply says, Asur lihisyachedim erva me'ha'arayos. You are not allowed to be alone with one of the prohibited relationships, an erva. Bein zakena, bein yalda, it doesn't matter how old they are, it doesn't matter how young they are. Shedavar zeh gorim legalos ervat. It leads to violation of the laws of prohibited relationships. And the exceptions he gives you are, a mother can be alone with a son, father can be alone with a daughter, husband and wife, even if she is in the state of nida. That is okay, but generally speaking, it is not okay. So when we discuss that in the shiur on yichud, we encourage taking certain steps to avoid yichud. So we talked about making sure that the door is not lockable from the inside. We talked about potentially having a third party present. The different ways, and of course we know in the secular world this has become an issue as well. This issue of not being alone during intimate examinations and the like. There are some different practices between the U.S. and Canada in this regard. The U.S. is more careful about this than Canada. If you jump for a second to source number 31. CPSO policy says, although third parties are not mandatory, the presence of a third party during an intimate examination may contribute to both patient and physician comfort. Patients should be given the option of having a third party present. In cases where a physician is unable to provide such a person, the patient should be informed that they may bring in a person of their choosing with them. So these are people, obviously, we're not dealing with it from a Hilchos Yichud standpoint. They're dealing with it from from common sense. But there are justifications in general within Jewish law for treating somebody of the opposite gender. The most clear justification is when you see the patient, you're busy as a professional. You're not thinking about your relationship with this person, except as a doctor seeing a patient, a nurse taking care of a patient. That's one justification. And then the second justification that goes with it is the potential penalties if you were to violate this, because from within the profession and within society, if someone gets caught doing something like this, they're going to lose their license. They could face all sorts of different sanctions. So Rav Moshe Feinstein in source number 30 presented this. He said, and again I'm going to go with the English in the interests of time, the common lenient practice, meaning the practice of seeing patients of the opposite gender, is based on the fact that the physician, Jewish or not, is busy with his work and distracted from desire. Even when he finishes his work, he can't stay with the patient during office hours. People are waiting for him. Even if other patients have not yet arrived, he is concerned that more might come. If she is the last of the day, so that the physician knows no more will come, and the aforementioned logic doesn't apply, people still rely on the presence of assistants in his clinic. This is one of those things where Moshe likes Yiddishisms. If you look in the Hebrew, he writes mirpa'ah and then in parentheses aleph pei yud samach. Office. So I decided to keep that in the English. The assistants would suspect him of impropriety were he to remain longer than normal in the room. Jewish or not, the doctor will avoid this lest he develop a bad reputation, and that's the justification that he provides. Not every posek is comfortable with this. Shlomo Zalman was not as comfortable with this as Rav Moshe. But generally speaking, these two arguments of professional reputation and licensure, as well as the fact that you're functioning as a professional and therefore that's where your focus is, tend to be relied upon to permit doctors to see patients of the opposite gender. However, when there are social connections, this becomes worse. And the CPSO recognizes that. Take a look at number 32. From their same document, Maintaining Appropriate Boundaries and Preventing Sexual Abuse. So Appendix A has various pieces of advice, and one of them is, be cognizant of social interactions with patients that may lead to romantic involvement. You have to know that sometimes you're asking for trouble. Because you're not only seeing the patient as a patient, you also know them in other contexts. And you have a similar point that's made by the Ramah. Did I bring it on the sheet? I did not bring the Ramah, but I brought instead Rosh Shlomo Zalman. Take a look at source number 33. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has quoted in the Nishmas Avram, says, Kimedumani, it appears to me, She'imhu Rofei Bayit, if he is the house doctor, Ukvar Badako Saharbe Pa'amim, and he has already checked her many times. Actually, I'm not sure that's what he meant by Rofei Bayit. Sorry?
Visiting a house?
No, that's not what it means.
No, you know what? I don't think that's what he means. I think he means
a house doctor.
In the hospital?
A regular doctor?
In the hospital?
Individual doctor?
No, what I'm thinking is actually something else. When I translated it, I first wrote house doctor, but I wonder if this doesn't actually mean in a non-explicit way OBGYN. I wonder if he's not using the term bayit. I wonder if that's not what he means. But either way, he has already checked her before. They may be considered to be overly comfortable with each other. And so even if you say, well, the husband is in the city, he could come in any time, he's still uncomfortable with this. He's not happy with this idea. And so others also maintain this concern. Even if in the office environment nothing could happen, because he sees her regularly outside of the office environment, there is additional concern. And so the logical piece of advice is what Rabbi Naftali Bar Ilan brings you in number 34. And this is actually from that booklet that I was mentioning, although I miswrote the title. I don't think it said Psychology in Judaism. I thought it said Psychotherapy in Judaism. I have to go back and look at it. But in any case, he says the following when asked this question. It is obvious that if during treatment the professional is not occupied with his craft and personal thoughts and feelings toward the patient are awakened, then he must refer to another therapist. He's dealing with it as a psychologist. This is also his duty in the professional ethics codes of many areas, meaning you have to be smart. You have to ask yourself, am I getting myself into trouble? And if so, then you have to refer to somebody else. But it's important to understand, because I think to a certain extent people just ignore this issue and feel like, well, of course it's okay, it's medical care. Not necessarily. You have to be smart about this. The CPSO recognizes it, and halacha is concerned for it. Questions on that or comments on that before we go to the last one? Okay, so the last case is the issue of reporting OHIP fraud. And here we get the doctor as civil servant. The only reason this comes up in a discussion of practicing medicine in the Jewish community is because it becomes a harder question to answer when it is within the Jewish community. The rules are fairly straightforward. If you take a look at 35, the Health Insurance Act, a prescribed person, which includes the doctor, who in the course of his or her professional or official duties has knowledge that an event referred to in subsection 2 has occurred, shall promptly report the matter to the general manager. And subsection 2 says, subsection 1 applies to the following events. An ineligible person receives or attempts to receive an insured service as if he or she were an insured person. So I gave you a simple case. And you can come up with variations on this. The case that I gave you was, Lisa and Tova are family doctors in a practice. Lisa notices that Tova recorded a treatment for the brother of a patient who actually received it. So she wrote it in for the wrong member of the family. She asks Tova, who explains the family had recently immigrated and the patient had not yet been in Ontario for 90 days. But the patient's brother had already completed the 90 days. So the idea is that the justification is, this is really just about paperwork. They could have filed it. They didn't file it. The doctor has a way to justify it for herself, but it's a violation. And it's a very clear violation, and the obligation on the doctor is very clear. The problem that we have is that we have a law on the books called Mosir, or Mesira. Jews have a very long history of not trusting the government because the government abused the Jewish community. It imprisoned people for ransom, fined people arbitrarily, executed people, confiscated their assets. And so you have a law on the books that says, if you take a look at the Rambam in source number 36, one may not hand a Jew to the control of the nations, whether physically or financially, even where he is wicked and a sinner, and even where he causes him trouble and pain. Anyone who gives a Jew to the nations, whether physically or financially, has no share in the next world. It seems unequivocal. But the truth is, it's a lot more equivocal than that. Because the Rambam is writing in a particular era, in a particular set of circumstances. It seems that as a matter of practical halacha, one indeed should report it for multiple reasons. First of all, there is a recognition within halacha that secular government has the authority to set criminal laws and their punishments. The Gemara in Bava Metzia, which I brought you in source 37, has Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, aid the police in arresting people. Right? Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon gave advice to a government police officer. He said, you want to know where all the crooks are? Go into the pub in the 4th hour of the day. When you see somebody drinking wine, holding a cup and dozing, ask around after him. If he's a scholar and he's dozing, it's because he got up early to study. If he's a worker, he rose early for labor. If he works at night, maybe he works with fine metal, and that's why no one knew that he was working at night because they didn't hear him. He was working with gold or something along those lines. But otherwise, he's a thief, and you can catch him. It sounds a little bit simple, no? One wonders why there were thieves anywhere. The word of this was brought to the government, and they said, let the reader of the scroll be the one to carry it out. They brought Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. They said to him, you're now a police officer. And he caught thieves. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karka sent to him, vinegar son of wine, meaning your father was wonderful. Your father was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. What happened to you? How long will you pass the nation of our God to be murdered? And Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon responded, I am eliminating thorns from the vineyard. To which the response was, let the owner of the vineyard come and eliminate his own thorns. There's no reason for you to be the one eliminating the thorns. But Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon does not seem to give in on this. And then you have a similar story with Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi taking on this role. The Rashba, writing in 13th century Spain, and it's in source number 38, dealt with this issue of going with the secular authority, and he said, if the witnesses, I'm going to jump to after the ellipsis. Certainly where there is government license, like in the case of Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon in Bava Metzia 83b, the government's rule will be recognized. But the designees must confer in the matter and perform their deeds after consultation. Their intent must always be for heaven. The key point was simply his citation of that Gemara as a matter of halacha, meaning that the rule is that the government has authority, and indeed it is recognized. The Shevet HaLevi, Rav Wozner, had a responsum on this, in which he talked about serving as a tax auditor. And he said the government has the ability to set the rules and to punish people if they violate the rules of the rules of taxation. Rav Moshe Feinstein had a tshuva that was a little more nuanced than the one from Rav Wozner. But based on this, the idea that the government has the power to do it, you can certainly say the government has the power to administer this system. They're administering it fairly. It applies to everybody equally. And you will honor the rules that they set. And on that basis, Rav Asher Weiss, in an audio lecture, I think it's actually the same audio lecture as the other one, but it's minute 53, the other end of the lecture, says that in today's society, which is a law-abiding society, and where the punishment that's given is a fair punishment that's applied to everybody, they're not going to be abused in this regard, there is no issue of Mesira at all. And therefore, you would indeed report what was being done. Now, of course, you have to know what you're talking about. It's really important that you not simply report rumor and get and create problems on the basis of something that's not so. You have to know what you're reporting. But if you know what's happening here, and you try to dissuade them, because yes, you should try to dissuade them first. You try to dissuade them and it doesn't work, then that's what you do. Your next step is your professional responsibility to make that report. Questions? Oh, that was an easy one. Okay. Yeah.
There's no element of Chil Hashem here?
Well, there is an element of Chil Hashem, but the element of Chil Hashem goes in multiple directions, right? As a matter of fact, writing in an earlier age, when there really was concern that when you hand people over to the secular government, they could be abused, the Rama wrote that if you have somebody who is engaged in counterfeiting, you turn them over, because they're endangering the community. And what's going to happen is, if they are found out eventually by somebody, it's going to redound to our harm much greater than what's going to happen to him when he gets turned in. He could have had that thought about Chil Hashem before he engaged in it. So we've seen 4 cases, and hopefully drawn some broader principles that apply even beyond those cases themselves. Billing for medical care given on Shabbos, the ideal would be to absorb it with care that's not given on Shabbos, but even without that, one would be able to bill. Obviously, you have to do the billing after Shabbos. You can't do the billing on Shabbos itself. Let's be clear. The second case that we dealt with, the doctor's rabbi versus the patient's rabbi. So we said that while the doctor himself or herself may not be able to carry out the procedure personally because their rabbi says it's prohibited, they would be allowed to do the referral. We gave the 3 different justifications for doing so. Seeing a patient of the opposite gender who one knows socially, so that may not be the best idea, even though in general we would justify seeing a patient of the opposite gender, where it's somebody you know socially, you really have to be careful and know yourself. And then last, in terms of reporting the Oed fraud, you would do it. You would be required to make that report, assuming you could not convince the other person not to engage in it at all. The next session is going to be, I think, on a Monday night at Shari Shamayim in December. I don't remember what the topic is offhand, but I will send it out when I send out the follow-up email. Please make sure that you signed in, and when I send out the follow-up email with the link to the evaluation, please take a minute to fill out the evaluation. It's very helpful for being able to get CME credit for the classes. Thank you very much.